Thank you, Miriam, and it was very impressive to hear the list of all of the co-sponsors for this event, in part because it tells you the sheer range of Israel activity, scholarship, engagement, and advocacy on this campus, and in part because it talks about what it means to build bridges and the kinds of coalitions that we can do here. I always get a kick out of hearing the groups that are collaborating on this campus that on most other campuses not only don't share a podium or share events, but are, to say the least, more antagonistic of each other. So I don't take that lightly, and we shouldn't either. And it is most appropriate that they all come together to bring Ambassador Dennis Ross back to our campus. He is one of ours as an honorary doctorate holder. That means that he is an alumnus of Brandeis University, which means not only we can bring him back home, but I can ask you for money. And the night is young, Dennis, the night is young. Ambassador Ross also, not once but twice, was a visiting professor on this campus as a Richmond Fellow. So we feel particularly close to him as a member of our team and as a member of the Brandeis family. He is currently counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Policy in Washington, D.C. He has served in numerous administrations in senior positions, most recently as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region. He spent a year as a Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. He was the point person on Middle East policy for both what in Washington they would call the Bush 41 administration. They're now talking about Bush 41, 43, will there be a 45? They only do odd numbers in that family. What is that? But then to stay on in the Clinton administration, and that's another thing that should not be taken lightly. In a time when, sadly, one might even say tragically, certainly dangerously, foreign policy in this country appears to be polarized and politicized, there was a time not so long ago, and hopefully yet again, when at the water's edge there was such a thing as American foreign policy, and when administrations, whether Democratic or Republican, when trying to deal with complex issues involved, particularly in the areas we talk about tonight and in the Middle East, would turn to the best people they could. And that one would imagine that when it came time for the Clinton administration to think about to whom to turn, the fact that Ambassador Ross had worked in the Bush 41 administration was not only not a negative, it was quite decidedly a positive. There was a time in Washington when they used to refer to a certain class of people as wise men or wise women, people whose wisdom on issues transcended politics and even transcended certain issues. And I think it is fair to say that Dennis Ross is in that category and in that tradition of wise people on issues that are dearly in need of some wisdom. I will leave you with this, which in a sense to me captures what Dennis Ross is all about. In his wonderful book, The Missing Piece, the inside story of the fight for Middle East peace, there are many wonderful insights, both inspiring and frustrating from that book. But I want to start on the opening page. It's dedicated to the children of the Middle East. To the children of the Middle East, meaning there is a future, and there is a need for that future to be infinitely brighter than the present we have created. When that happens, I'm quite confident Ambassador Dennis Ross will be a part of that. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Dennis Ross.
Don't get scared, I'm not going to sing. For some reason, I just feel more comfortable sometimes talking like this. Once I made the mistake at a college campus where I said, I'm not going to play Phil Donahue, which drew completely blank looks. Not over here, it's not drawing any blank looks, but over here. Look, thank you, it's really nice to be back. I enjoyed my time at Brandeis twice as a visiting professor. The students were great, and I spent today here. Meeting lots of different students, graduate students and undergraduate students and faculty. And it was, once again, a kind of scintillating, inspiring set of experiences because it reminds me of the level of interest and curiosity that you find on campuses, and that, in fact, too often we are in danger of losing, sometimes because there's a political correctness that emerges that shrinks the scope of discussion, and it shouldn't do that. Tonight, I will talk about the Middle East as a whole. You would be very surprised if I start off and I didn't say something about what's going on between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I will start by having offering a little bit of a perspective to you. I do have a new book that's coming out in October, and it's called Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israeli Relationship from Truman to Obama, and I do a chapter on every administration, every president, divisions around the president, and the like. And I can put the current reality in some perspective, as I suggested, because it's not the first time we've seen tension between a president and a prime minister. It happens that Ronald Reagan, during the siege of Beirut in August of 1982, and then Sabin Shatila in September of 1982, on multiple occasions not only threatened the future of the relationship with Begin, but he also actually suspended arms shipments to Israel 3 times as a punishment, something that seems not to be considered and something that seems out of the realm, but that wasn't the case then. In the Bush administration, Bush 41, and it is true that I've been a political appointee in 2 Republican administrations and 2 Democratic administrations, and as I say, that makes me an extinct species these days, but perhaps we'll find people like that coming back. In the first Bush administration, Bush 41, there was the loan guarantee struggle, which is the only way to describe it. Bush 41 did not trust Yitzhak Shamir at all. Their very first meeting was a meeting that went very badly because it was one-on-one. Bush said to Shamir that, "I have a real problem with settlements," and Shamir said to him, "Well, they shouldn't be a problem." And Bush heard that as meaning, okay, there won't be any more building, came out and told Baker and me that he's not going to build any more settlements, to which I said, that can't be. And yet he said, no, he agreed. And sure enough, he gets back home and he announces new settlements. And Bush, having done this one-on-one, done it in a way designed not to put him on the spot in front of people who worked for Shamir, felt this was a betrayal. Never trusted him after that. So Bush, who was actually, by character and persona, was someone who was always civil. The only person with whom he had a gruff relationship, oftentimes a confrontational relationship, was Shamir. So we have that reality. We have the reality of Bill Clinton, who is probably the one American president who could go run in Israel today and actually be elected prime minister. And that's not an exaggeration, by the way. At one point, he got so mad at Netanyahu that he not only wouldn't see him when he came to the country, both their airplanes were parked next to each other in Los Angeles at the same time. And he wouldn't talk to him and wouldn't see him. So there is a certain legacy that, notwithstanding all of that, you still have a relationship because it's rooted in something, and it's worth keeping that in mind as we look at where we are today. And one way to keep in mind where we are today is actually look at the rest of the region. One of the reasons that this relationship isn't going to go off the rails is because look at the region. By the way, there may be a heavy preoccupation here with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but there isn't a heavy preoccupation in the region. If you ask yourself, what are the Saudis preoccupied with right now? Well, they've launched a major military operation into Yemen. There's a focus on Iran for them. You know, there is a preoccupation in Egypt with the future of what Egypt is going to be, an existential struggle within Egypt itself. Syria is a catastrophic war, literally a catastrophic war, 250,000 dead, half the population, more than half the population displaced either as refugees outside the country or within the country in the worst conceivable conditions. I was just in Jordan a week before last. I went to the Zatari refugee camp in northern Jordan, 85,000 people, fourth largest city in Jordan. I can assure you, these are innocents. You know, when Bashar al-Assad wants to talk about everybody who's fighting him as terrorists, well, not all the little kids I saw running around, not all the families I saw there. This is a catastrophic conflict that has strategic implications. The point is that there are preoccupations in the region because there is a struggle going on in the region, and obviously the Obama administration has a priority. Its priority right now is to try to negotiate a nuclear deal with the Iranians and to try to roll back ISIS. When we look at Iraq today, and I can't help it, it's the professor in me as well that will, I'm not just going to talk to you, although I will talk to you, but I'm going to pose some questions to you as well. And one question I want to start with is, do you think that the United States and Iran are partners in Iraq? What do you think? Are we partners in Iraq? All right, so let me give you some more context, and then I'll ask the question again. So today in Iraq, we are bombing Tikrit, which is, you know, actually where Saddam Hussein came from. Was taken over by ISIS in Anbar province. Most of the militias who are there trying to remove them from Tikrit are Shia militias. Qasem Soleimani, who is the head of the Al-Quds brigades of the Al-Quds forces of the Revolutionary Guard, the RGC of Iran, up until a week ago was there directing the operations. And today we bombed the ISIS targets there. Now it's true that Qasem Soleimani left last week, and if you read the New York Times article, what you'll see is that we weren't prepared to do this so long as he was around. We weren't prepared to do this if it looked like the Shia militias were going to be the beneficiaries, and yet it's the Shia militias who make up almost all of the fighting forces on the ground around Tikrit. So we're bombing there, and the Shia militias, all of which, by the way, the Badr brigades, Kutayb Hezbollah, Asayb al-Haq, these Shia militias are financed, trained, armed by the Iranians. They're responsible. We lost probably 1,000 dead to the Shia militias when we were in Iraq. These are the militias that we lost 1,000 dead to. They're the ones basically carrying the brunt of the fighting right now. And yet, so we bombed Tikrit, number one. The Iranians probably have more forces on the ground in Iraq than we do. We have close to 3,000 now. They are flying drones, we are flying drones. They have carried out bombing missions, we have carried out bombing missions. So now I'm going to repeat my question. Are we partners in Iraq? What do you think? How many people here, I'll ask for a show of hands, how many people here think that we are partners in Iraq? Okay. How many people think we are not partners in Iraq? How many people don't know? Okay, so the don't knows have it. Well, let me take this line of discussion a little further. Are we partners in the region? I mean, in Iraq, we have a priority to basically erode and roll back, degrade and then roll back ISIS. And obviously Iran views them as a threat, because they are a threat to them. So we have a converging interest as it relates to ISIS in Iraq. And there's an old saw that the enemy of my enemy is my enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Although I was going to say in the Middle East, my lesson from that is typically the enemy of my enemy usually is still my enemy. But in this case, there's a convergence of interests. Now, there's a question in Iraq as to whether we really are partners in my mind or not. Iraq will not become stable again if Shia militias go in and liberate Sunni areas and then carry out revenge attacks against the Sunnis who are there. When the Badr Brigade and the other Shia militias freed the city of Amerli in Iraq, there were revenge killings afterwards. If they do similar things now, this is what produced ISIS in the first place, after the surge in Iraq led to the defeat of al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2007, 2008. So the question becomes, does Iran permit a strong enough Iraqi government? The current prime minister of Iraq wants to create what he calls a civil police, a civil set of forces for the Sunni areas, for Anbar province, that would be under the umbrella of the central government. And these would be Sunni forces that would be responsible for security in the area. Now, he's been blocked from financing those forces or raising them by the Shia militias in particular, and the Shia forces, and Iranian influence. So if that's the case, we're not going to see Iraq put back together again. If Iran defines the key to its interest in Iraq being the maintenance of the Shia militias, you're not going to see Iraq, in a sense, reunified under some kind of central authority, even if it's a kind of federal arrangement where there's a lot of autonomy underneath. It remains to be seen. I think the early evidence at this point is that we're probably not partners in Iraq. We have a converging set of interests, but we're really not partners in Iraq. So, are we partners in Yemen? That's a rhetorical question. No. The Houthis, who are backed by the Iranians, I wouldn't say the Houthis aren't the equivalent of the Shia militias I've been talking about. They're backed by the Iranians, they have arms from the Iranians, they've got finance from the Iranians, but it's not the same thing, it's not the same relationship. They're much more indigenous to the northern part of Yemen, but they, when they carried out a coup against the government in Sana'a, what were the banners that first appeared after they carried out the coup? I'm posing the question, but this one I'll answer. Actually, usually whenever I pose a question, I can answer it. So what were the banners? Death to America and death to Israel. Now, do you really think that most of the tribes in Yemen are focused on Israel? When you hear death to America and death to Israel, who does that remind you of? Does it sound like the no ruse message this past Saturday that the Supreme Leader gave in Iran? The banners were out there in force, death to America, and there were chants, death to America. And of course, death to Israel is very prominent in what you find in Iran. So the Houthis emerged suddenly in Sana'a, and their banners are death to America, death to Israel. So there's clearly an Iranian connection there. Today, we announced that we were also providing intelligence and logistics support to what is a Saudi military operation with 9 other countries in Yemen to try to reverse what it seems to be the tide of what the Houthis are doing. All right, so I don't think we're partners in Iraq for the reasons I said. We're clearly not partners in Yemen. So are we partners in Syria? They are all in behind Bashar al-Assad. They committed Hezbollah in a huge way. Hezbollah has taken very serious casualties in Syria. They have lost, obviously, some of their own forces, at least some of the people they put on the ground in Syria. They're all in for Bashar al-Assad, and at least our stated policy is that we think he has to go. I don't think it's any longer our priority that he needs to go soon, but our stated policy is he has to go. So I think it's fair to say we're probably not partners in Syria, although it's conceivable that in Syria, if there's going to be a political outcome where Bashar al-Assad goes, the Iranians will have to be part of that to make sure he actually goes. But I would say, at least on the surface, and maybe beyond the surface, we are not partners in Syria. How about Lebanon? Are we partners in Lebanon? Is there a theme that's beginning to emerge here? Okay, so we're probably not partners in Lebanon. I mean, Hezbollah holds Lebanon in a kind of, it is able to paralyze almost everything. So we're not partners there. I think it's fair to say, when it comes to Israel, since the Supreme Leader has identified 9 points that would lead to the end of Israel, we're really not partners when it comes to Israel and to the issue of peace. And certainly the Palestinian Authority doesn't view us as being partners. I was just in the West Bank also last week, and one of the things I discovered is that while their focus is heavily on Israel, they're very worried about what Iran is doing with Hamas now and what Iran is doing with Hezbollah above the Jordanian northern border, and they're worried about what's going to mean for them. So when you survey the region, it's fair to say that we're not partners with the Iranians, even though we have a converging interest when it comes to the question of trying to roll back ISIS. That's a converging interest. All right, so is what we're seeing in the region, because you really have two proxy wars right now. You have a proxy war in Syria, you have a proxy war in Yemen between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So is this conflict in the Middle East, is it a Sunni-Shia conflict? What do you think? How many people here think it's a Sunni-Shia conflict? Okay, how many people think it's not a Sunni-Shia conflict? How many people don't know? Okay, so don't knows have it, okay. Well, ISIS is Sunni. And the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Jordanians, certainly after the Jordanian pilot was burned alive, the Jordanians, they're fighting ISIS as well. So that's Sunni-Sunni, that's not Sunni-Shia. And if I take you back to last summer, and the conflict in Gaza last summer, think about the following. There were demonstrations throughout Europe in response to the Gaza conflict. You know where there were no demonstrations? I mean, demonstrations in Europe against Israel, given what was going on in the conflict in Gaza. You know where there were no demonstrations? There were no demonstrations against the Israelis in the Middle East. Does that strike you as a little odd? I mean, 2,000 Palestinians were killed, and no demonstrations against the Israelis outside of the West Bank in the Middle East. Why was that? You like how I ask these questions? I mean, it's my way of eliciting interest and seeing if you're paying attention. Why was that? Well, because it was Israel fighting Hamas, and Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. And Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and the Emiratis and Algeria and Morocco all wanted Hamas to lose because they wanted Muslim Brotherhood to lose. And the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas are what? They're Sunnis. So it's not a Sunni-Shia conflict. It is a conflict between radical Islamists and what I'll call non-Islamists. Radical Islamists who basically, even if they're Sunni and they're Shia and they're fighting each other, they have a number of things in common. They don't accept civil authority. They don't accept the legitimacy of individual states. They want to remake the region in their image. They believe that terror is an instrument that they can use to pursue the remaking of the Middle East in their image. They reject the principle of the other, meaning they don't accept the principle of minority rights or pluralism. They want the U.S. out of the area, and they reject Israel's right to exist. Whether they are a radical Sunni Islamist or a radical Shia Islamist, that's what they have in common, even if they fight each other. Now, this is a context in which we look at the Middle East today. When I said earlier that maybe here we get preoccupied on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, in the region itself, there isn't the same preoccupation. There is a preoccupation with what is a struggle in the region, which is ultimately about who is going to define the identity of those who live in the Middle East, how they define themselves, what the relationship is between them and the state, what is the role of Islam politically. All of these are questions that are going to be sorted out, and they're going to be shaped, frankly, over the next 10 to 20 years. There's not going to be a simple answer to this. It's going to take time. So that's a context in which we approach or think about this region. I want to say something about the Israelis and the Palestinians. I want to say something about where we are. I want to say something about how to think about the conflict But I want to start by going back to Gaza. And the reason I want to go back to Gaza is not only because the situation there is terrible, but also, again, I want to correct certain impressions. I mean, Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say that everybody is entitled to their own opinions, they're just not entitled to their own facts. And there is a narrative out there that the reason the situation in Gaza is so terrible is because the Israelis imposed a siege on Gaza. And I don't want to deny the fact that the situation in Gaza is terrible. It is terrible. But I want to tell you a little bit of the history before we get more to the present, and then what needs to be done, or what could be done between Israelis and Palestinians. So, how many people here remember that Israel withdrew from Gaza in the summer of 2005? Okay, they withdrew 100%. Now, the story is they imposed a siege after they left, but that's not true. And I want to tell you a story because I was invited to speak in Gaza about 6 months before the Israeli withdrawal by someone who today is a deputy to Abu Mazen. He's from Gaza. At that time, he was a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. I'd known him a long time, and he asked if I would come and speak in Gaza to an audience that he would put together. And so I was not in the administration. This was during the Bush time, so I wasn't in the government at the time. But I was still pretty prominent out there because I was still sort of the visible embodiment of America's very deep engagement, which after Clinton, if you remember the first term of the Bush administration, they really kind of walked away from peace process. They never appointed an envoy. And so I was sort of the last embodiment of that kind of a role. So I go and I'm invited to speak, and the first person I see as I walk up to the building where I'm going to speak is Mahmoud Zahar. And Mahmoud Zahar is a co-founder of Hamas. And I turned to, it's Ziad Abu Amr, I turned to him before I could say anything. He said, I really thought it would be a good idea. We actually collectively thought it would be a really good idea for the opposition to hear you. And I go, oh, it might have been nice to know that before I came, particularly when I got in and I looked and I saw that most of the leadership of Hamas was there, and I thought very hard about what my relationship with Ariel Sharon was at the time, since almost everybody on his hit parade at that point was in one building at the same time. But we got past that, and it didn't change the character of what I had to say. Because what I had to say to them, you know, it really didn't matter whether people from Hamas were there or not. What I had to say was that this is an opportunity for you. Israel's getting out of Gaza. And Palestinians have an opportunity, really for the first time, to control what happens here. I said, historically, you may feel that Palestinians have never been in a position where they could shape their own destiny. That it was always the Arabs in '48 who told you what you could do. Arafat said to me when we were at Camp David in the summer of 2000 that he'd wanted to go to Camp David with Sadat, but the Soviets and the Syrians had prevented him from going. I don't really know if that was true, but it was the kind of story that he told. The point was that I was saying to this group, this is within your power. You can turn Gaza, when Israel leaves, into a going concern. And if you do that, it isn't just the international community, but the people in Israel will say, well, okay, if this works, when we withdraw, we get out, then why not apply it to the West Bank as well? But if you turn Gaza into a platform for attacks against Israel, if you turn it into a haven of terror, who's going to say, gee, let's take that failed model and apply it to the West Bank as well? So I said, this is in your hands. You can determine this, and you should seize the opportunity. Well, we know what Hamas chose to do. When the Israelis withdrew, it took 4 weeks, from the middle of August to the middle of September. 2 weeks into the withdrawal, there was a bus bombing in Beersheba that Hamas carried out. So Israel's getting out of Gaza, and this is what you do? Over the next 6 months, Israel had 6 crossing points into Gaza, where goods and people could move back and forth. Actually, there was a division between which of the crossing points were for goods and which were for people. Over the course of that 6 months, there were 9 attacks on the crossing points. So Israel reduced the crossing points from 6 to 2 and reduced the hours that they could be operating. What was Hamas doing? It wanted to score and make a point. It was about fighting Israel. It was not about turning Hamas, it was not about turning Gaza into a going concern. So fast forward to the war last summer. You know, I said I was just in Israel. It was the first time I actually went down into one of the tunnels. And what's very clear is that while there was an embargo on what could go into Gaza, that's for sure, the fact of the matter is that Israel, first of all, didn't impose that embargo until after the attacks and then when Hamas took over later in Gaza. And then, at the time when Israel was limiting what could go into Gaza, I recall when I was in the White House saying that I felt that there needed to be a relaxation of the controls on what was going into Gaza. And I said, look, I think the situation is terrible there, and I think you have to relax it. And the Israelis at the time said to me, but if we do, whatever material we allow to go in, Hamas is going to divert it for purposes of building tunnels and command posts and the like. Well, they were right and I was wrong. Because last summer, what we saw was, you know, there wasn't a shortage of steel or electric wiring or cement underground. There was a shortage above ground. And Hamas built tunnels not to protect its people. It built tunnels to protect its leaders, its weapons, and its fighters. You know, when people ask, how come Israel lost so few in the conflict and the Palestinians lost so many? Well, there's a lot of answers, but the Israelis didn't just have Iron Dome. The Israelis have shelters for their people. Hamas built an underground capacity to fight Israel, not to build Gaza. Now, in the aftermath of the war, yeah, there was a terrible toll that the Palestinians in Gaza paid because, in fact, Hamas fires from civilian areas. After the war, there was a decision made by Israel, the PA, and the UN where they came up with a mechanism that would guide materials going into Gaza. And it hasn't been carried out. But it hasn't been carried out because it depended on the PA, the Palestinian Authority, going into the crossing points into Gaza, and they haven't been prepared to do that. Haven't been prepared to do it partly for reasons might be understandable in the sense that the PA controls the crossing points, but Hamas controls the rest of what's in Gaza. The problem is for Abu Mazen, if you look at what's going on in Palestinian society, he has lost most of his credibility. And you can say there's lots of reasons for it, including he hasn't been able to succeed with the Israelis. But right now, having just seen Halil Shikaki, who actually spends part of his year here, Halil says that his polling shows that the vast majority of Palestinians are blaming Abu Mazen for being completely indifferent to what's happening in Gaza, where you have at least 60,000 buildings that were either totally or partially destroyed, and the process of rebuilding is being held up because the mechanism that is agreed isn't acted on because the PA doesn't go into the crossing points. So if you're going to affect Abu Mazen's standing among Palestinians, something has to happen in Gaza. All right. Something has to happen in Gaza, something has to happen between the Israelis and the Palestinians. How do we make that happen? Well, one way to make it happen is to understand why we haven't been able to make progress. And, you know, the Prime Minister's recent statements on there'll be no Palestinian state so long as he's Prime Minister made, you know, in the weekend before the election, and then his statement on Election Day that the Arabs were voting in droves. These are not exactly statements that either endear him to the international community, certainly did not endear him to the President of the United States, but don't exactly add to creating a climate that makes it possible to move ahead. And we need to be mindful of that, and in a sense, the Israelis will need to be mindful of what they do. But we also should be mindful of what's happened when we've tried to produce a peace settlement in the negotiations over what amounts to 3 different efforts over the last 15 years. Because if you're going to make any effort to change the situation, you need to understand what's happened and why it happened and why we weren't successful before. There is, again, another narrative that's out there, and the narrative is that, you know, in effect, today it's the Israelis who don't want peace and it's the Palestinians who do. And what I would grant you is that there is complete disbelief in Israel and there is complete disbelief among Palestinians. Neither one believes that the other believes or is committed to 2 states. In the case of the Israelis, they're convinced that the Palestinians, when they say 2 states, what they mean is a Palestinian state and a binational state. In the case of the Palestinians, they look at Israel and they say, look, if they really believe in 2 states, why are they building and what would be our state? And by the way, there's no good answer to that one. So they each deeply disbelieve, and I would say the attitudes between the 2 sides right now, emotionally and psychologically, are worse than they've been at any point since I've worked on this issue. And to think that you can go from an environment of complete disbelief to suddenly making peace is an illusion. So again, the question is, what do we have to do and what is possible? Well, one thing to understand is we've had 3 efforts to solve the whole thing with the Clinton parameters in the year 2000. I know something about the Clinton parameters since I drafted them. And Arafat said no. Olmert's effort in 2008, alone with Abu Mazen, where he presented his effort to sort of cut through everything, and he presented a set of proposals that went very far. They were close to the Clinton parameters, but in some ways they went beyond the Clinton parameters because we didn't actually provide for 100% of territory when it came to the borders. We came close, but he does. And that drew no comment. And then the effort that was made last year with John Kerry that went on for 9 months that led the President of the United States to present to Abu Mazen on March 17th of last year a complete proposal on how to resolve at a level of principle each of the core issues, including Jerusalem, that went beyond what had been agreed with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The President asked for a response, and he got no response. Now, there's a reason, I think, that you've seen 2 episodes where there was no response. Arafat I put in a different category. In the Q&A, I can explain the different category. Abu Mazen, I used to say the difference between the 2 of them is Arafat had the capability but not the intention to make peace, and Abu Mazen had the intention but not the capability to make peace. And I would say there is a political culture on the Palestinian side where the sense of wound, grievance, hurt, and injustice is so great that the idea of compromising with the Israelis is simply rejected. And so when you actually are offered a proposal that requires some compromise on the Palestinian side, the answer is, if not no, it's no comment. Now, I see nothing in the current situation that suggests that if we once again put together a proposal, it would draw a response on the Palestinian side. On the Israeli side, as I said, there's kind of disbelief. So what do you do? And my answer to that at this point is the following. You focus on how you change the circumstances between the 2 sides. And it has to start with the Israelis. Right now, not because what you do with the Israelis is going to produce a response from the Palestinians, because it will not. But you focus on the Israelis because, in a sense, there is a delegitimization movement that is gaining steam, and in the aftermath of the Israeli election and the Prime Minister's comments, it probably will have even more momentum. And I think the President's responses over the last couple of days, which I suspect will be tempered soon, if not now, have added to that because, again, it puts the onus on the Israelis. And when you put the onus on the Israelis, it gives the Palestinians even more of a reason not to do anything. So if you're going to change anything, I think the Israelis in the first instance have to prove that when the Prime Minister says that, when he talked about there won't be a Palestinian state as long as he's there, he was simply saying that implementing a state at this point is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, which is not to say that he rejects the principle, but yet you can't implement it. But if, in fact, he wants to say that he favors two states, and he said explicitly he's against one state, then he ought to make a settlement policy consistent with his support for two states, at least as a principle. If you're saying that you can't produce two states right now, at a minimum, your obligation is don't make it harder. So the key, I think, the first step that needs to be taken is to get the next Israeli government, whenever it emerges, which shouldn't be too long from now, to realize that it needs to take an initiative. And that initiative should be to make its settlement policy consistent with its two-state policy, meaning there will not be settlement building in what the Israelis see as being part of what will be the Palestinian state, which means basically look at the security barrier and don't build anything to the east, which means in 92% of the West Bank you don't build. The virtue of doing this is that it makes the words that you believe in two states far more credible. If you take it one step further and decide that you're going to take steps that will also make life easier for Palestinians, there's two things that could be done. One is Palestinians could be allowed to export without Israeli controls over their exports. It's perfectly understandable Israel controls what's imported because, there's a security consideration. Why they control what's exported is something I couldn't easily explain, and I think this is something that could be lifted and would make a difference financially. And I would open up Area C for Palestinian building. Area C is 60% of the West Bank. Israel has security and civil responsibility for it. And if Palestinians could build housing there, it would respond to what is actually a real housing shortage. And it would also, because it's an employment vehicle, it would also add a lot, I think, to the Palestinian economy. And psychologically would show something practically is changing on the ground in a way that Palestinians would feel and notice. So here's three things the Israelis could do. Now, at one level, they could justify doing it simply as a way of proving they're doing their part, whether the Palestinians respond or not. There is, for many of you who follow Israel know, there's a concept in Israel, nobody wants to be a friar. Nobody wants to be a sucker. And so to do something where you're giving and you're not getting, that would make you a friar. Now, there's two ways to answer that. One would be by what the U.S. is prepared to do. And in fact, one way to get the next Israeli government to do this would be for the U.S. to go quietly, not publicly, quietly and say, look, our capacity to help you on the world stage, to prevent Security Council resolutions you don't want, or to help blunt the delegitimization movement, our capacity to do that is really limited. Even if we wanted to do it, it's really limited. We need you to give us something that we can work with. Now, if you would at least take the first step, and maybe take one of the other steps, that could really give us something to work with to begin to build a campaign, which also has the virtue of blunting, now it's being used against you, but it has the virtue of beginning to put pressure on the Palestinians to respond. Don't expect that they're going to respond up front. Now, the truth is, if we had this from the Israelis, we could then quietly go to the Palestinians and say, this is what the Israelis are going to do. It would be smart for you to find a way to respond. Because if you do, pressures won't build up on you to respond, and you will actually preempt that. And you can do it by saying, all right, you're not going to maintain the internationalization effort against the Israelis. You are prepared to come back to negotiations. But also, you will put the PA into the crossing points in Gaza. Israel wants that. Israel would likely see that as a benefit for it, because if you don't act soon to relieve the pressure that's building up within Gaza, we will have another explosion in Gaza. Last summer, it went on for 51 days. And I don't think there's anybody in Israel, including the Prime Minister, who would be eager to see that again anytime soon. It's not good for Palestinians, but it's not good for Israel either. So there would be something that would be seen as a step that is meaningful to the Israelis. Starting this way allows you to begin to change the interaction between Israelis and Palestinians. It allows you to begin to tackle what I said is a dynamic that is so bad right now that if you went to the negotiating table, even if you could get to the negotiating table, you'd produce one more failure. The US doesn't need one more failure. The disbelief that each side feels today is a function of cynicism and constant failures, raised expectations that get frustrated. We don't need anything else that's going to add to that. We need to create, for the first time in a long time, a virtuous cycle between Israelis and Palestinians. And this could be a starting point. I mean, I would go from there. If you got this, I would look at other things the Israelis could do that would further cement their commitment to two states. You know, like, for example, at some point, not now, but after you've started something, create an agenda where the Israelis could identify certain steps that they would take and the Palestinians could identify certain steps that they would take, each designed to demonstrate their commitment to two states. You know, what I said about settlements is a good way to begin the process on the Israeli side. They could create incentives for those who lived outside, to the east of the barrier, to move back into Israel. They could begin building housing for them. On the Palestinian side, you know, the Palestinian side could actually begin, for the first time, to talk about two states for two peoples. Actually acknowledge there's two national movements, and that's why you have to have two states for two peoples, something that they don't say. They could scale back dramatically the level of incitement in the Israeli media. In the Palestinian media. Watch Palestinian TV for 5 minutes. You don't have to watch it longer than that. And you'll find the Israelis are responsible for every conceivable ill, and even some inconceivable ills. Well, if all you're doing is demonizing, pretty hard to get to where you need to go. The point is, if we're going to get back to peacemaking, you actually have to create a context or an environment for peacemaking. That doesn't exist today, and the right way to go is not to try to solve the whole conflict. The right way to go is not to create two alternatives where if you can't solve the whole conflict, you do nothing. If we've learned one thing about the Middle East, and this brings me back to where I started in terms of the context, if we've learned one thing about the Middle East, it is when you reduce your choices to doing everything or doing nothing, meaning you do everything because you're going to solve it all, and if you can't, you do nothing, what you guarantee is you will do nothing. And when we do nothing, you create a vacuum. And one thing that comes through clearly in the Middle East, when you create a vacuum, it gets filled. But the forces who fill it are the forces we least want to see. Whether that's in Iraq, in Syria, or in this issue, if we limit our choices to a binary choice of doing everything or doing nothing, we're going to perpetuate what we see now. And I think our hope ought to be that we will change what becomes possible so that what isn't possible today can become possible tomorrow. When I say to people, look, I still believe in the two-state outcome, my answer when I say that is, give me an alternative. You think the Israelis are going someplace? You think the Palestinians are going someplace? You think a one-state outcome is an alternative? Show me one place in the Middle East where there's more than one identity in a state. Show me that state that is at peace. It doesn't exist. Those states are at war. And unless you want to keep this a perpetual conflict, you'll look for ways to promote what is a two-state outcome. Eventually we can get there, but we have to start by changing the context. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ross. We are now going to open up for questions. We have 2 standing mics, so if you want to begin lining up, we're going to take questions from each side, alternating, and take 2 questions at a time. And we have Ambassador Ross until about 8:20, 8:25, so that's a substantial amount of time. So don't be shy. Please come down, and we'll start with this question, and then this question, and then go from there. So go ahead.
Hi, My name is Yakov. Thanks again for coming to speak with us today. My question is, earlier in your talk, you mentioned briefly about the intense distrust between Netanyahu and the Clinton administration. And I'm wondering, based on your experiences in negotiations and based on your views of Netanyahu's actions, which of the two statements that Netanyahu has made in the past 2 weeks do you believe more? The one pre-election where he mentioned that he no longer views the two-state solution as viable, or the one post-election where he's now recommitted himself?
Go ahead with your question.
First question is, all the polls show that Hamas actually would have a majority in the West Bank if there were elections there, and this is why Mahmoud Abbas is not running for elections. What do you think is going to happen? He's not going to be there for a long time. Question number two is about a little bit more positive scenario. If we were to get to a situation where there is a settlement, what do you think, or was it part of your plan that the refugee camps would be dismantled, people would move into new cities, and something good would be built there, like industrial parks, malls, something that really creates hope for the Palestinians?
So let me take the last one first. If you go back to the Clinton parameters, we were talking about creating a very large fund for the Palestinian refugees. We had a $20 to $30 billion fund in mind. Obviously, it wasn't just going to be funded by us. It was going to be an international fund. The purpose was to provide compensation for those who chose not to come back, to provide, meaning to go to the new state of Palestine, to provide monies for those who chose to stay where they were, and to provide monies for those who would come back and to help with the development. Obviously, the refugee camps themselves need to be obviously transformed. You know, it's interesting. In Gaza, half the population lives in refugee camps. In the West Bank, about 8% of the population lives in refugee camps. By definition, these have taken on a permanent character. There's been a lot of building, but it's sort of makeshift. People aren't allowed to move out of the camps. So there needs to be a revitalization, there needs to be a rebuilding, there needs to be massive reconstruction, all of which, by the way, again, just like when I talked about building an Area C for housing, same thing. It's good for the Palestinians, it's good for their economy. I do think that would have been part of any peace plan had it emerged. As for what you asked about Abu Mazen, I guess a couple points. You're right. I mean, the polling, this is what Halil Shikaki's polls show, that if there was an election today, he would lose to Ismail Haniyeh. And that can be changed if he does something on Gaza, if he's seen as doing something on Gaza. So the starting point is to do something on that. But you were asking something differently. You were asking what happens after him. And nobody can tell you that. There's been no preparation for what comes next. You know, I suspect some kind of collective approach to begin with. But there's no one that you can point to with any high degree of confidence is likely to emerge. My guess is you have some kind of deal to begin with that's collective, and then over time someone emerges. But there's no simple answer on that. Which of his statements do I take seriously? Well, I think the first one was obviously a political statement trying to get to recoalesce the right around him and ensure that the right vote wouldn't be splintered, and he succeeded in getting that. Look, I think when he says that you can't implement a two-state solution right now, I think he believes that statement. I think it's pretty hard to disagree with that statement because today, who controls Gaza? Not the PA. If we could negotiate an agreement, there's no obvious way to implement it in Gaza unless Hamas is prepared to acquiesce in it. So I think he believes the second statement, but the problem isn't what I believe, the problem is what most leaders internationally believe. I don't think most leaders internationally take his approach to two states seriously. And I think what President Obama has certainly put himself on record saying he doubts it. And I think there's probably very few others who don't doubt it. That's why I say one way to correct the image is to say, you know what? I mean what I say, and that's why we're going to change our settlement policy to make it clear that we actually do favor two states. We'll make it consistent with that.
So we'll begin over here and then jump over.
Good evening. My name is Ben Margolin, and first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this evening. My question is like this. If the status quo remains, and in the interim, while there's no deal, there are different perceptions as to which side benefits. In other words, in the meantime, where there is no deal, there are certain people that believe that Palestinians will benefit and they'll get the upper leg, and there are people that believe that Israelis will get the upper leg. Who's right?
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Charlie Berman. I'd like to return to your comments at the very beginning of your talk regarding American-Iranian relations. This morning, John Bolton had a piece in the New York Times in which he took the most extreme position regarding what the U.S. should do in response to nuclear developments in Iran. There are other positions as well that are on the right and that are at odds with the position of the Obama administration. For example, Netanyahu said that stronger sanctions should be applied. Bolton said that no sanctions of any kind would work, and the only thing that might work would be destroying the Iranian nuclear capability. And of course, in the center or on the left, there's the notion that negotiations might bear fruit. So I'm curious about your own understanding of this spectrum of ideas regarding what's going on in Iran.
Okay, so the answer to that one's going to take a little longer. The answer to yours is very short and simple. They're both wrong. There's, right now, both are on a self-destructive path. Because if nothing is done, the delegitimization movement will produce increasing isolation of Israel. And the effort of those who are delegitimizing is not about settlements. It's about Israel's existence. The Bds movement is a completely dishonest movement. It tries to create the impression it's about settlement. Look at the principles of the Bds movement. The principles mean one state. Means no Israel. And if you do nothing, you play into the hands of them, you allow them to continue to disguise what their purpose is, rather than exposing them for who they are. Take away their argument by acting on the settlements the way I suggest. If you do it, then let's see what they do. Suddenly you'll see they won't stay focused on BDS, on boycott, divestment, and sanctions related to the territories. It'll be about Israel itself. And that's important to recognize because their appeal, particularly in Europe, is, appeals to those who believe that Israel should exist, but who have a problem with the settlements. And as long as they're allowed to get away with that, it's going to deepen Israel's isolation and add to the problems. As for the Palestinians, you go to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, it won't produce, look, first of all, there's been 2 successful prosecutions, against, in Sudan and in the Congo. The number of deaths in the Congo are 5 million. In the Sudan, they number also, in the million area. And it took years to produce those. So even if you go that route, it's not going to change anything. It's not going to end Israeli occupation. It's not going to produce a Palestinian state. And by the way, it'll add to the sense of frustration on Palestinians because you're choosing a path that yields nothing. You build expectations and you produce nothing. So it's, in the end, it adds to the frustration. It will build the appeal of extremists on the Palestinian side without producing anything for Palestinians. So they're both wrong. Iran. Look, the key, what's the objective? The objective is to ensure that Iran doesn't become a nuclear weapon state. Now, if you bomb the Iranians, you can set back their program. You can't bomb their know-how. You can't bomb their engineering. So you can set them back and they'd have to rebuild. If you bomb without international support, others won't sanction the Iranians and they'll be able to build more quickly. Is it really true that we'll bomb every time they get close? I don't think so. And if you bomb, you think what, they don't do anything in return? So having said that, that doesn't mean that if you see them dashing for that capability, you shouldn't bomb. So I view that as an option that should be exercised if we see them actively moving towards it. With a negotiation, you have a chance to prevent them in a way that could be more sustainable. But the agreement also can't leave them in a position where, at a time of their choosing, they can break out because they're so close. So you got two spectrums here. You got, two extremes. One is, let's negotiate an agreement, but basically it almost doesn't matter what the agreement is, just as long as we have an agreement. And the other is, let's bomb because there's no answer short of bombing. I mean, each of these, this is obviously a shock that I come out in the center. There is a way to negotiate an agreement. We're obviously close to agreement. There are questions related to the agreement that's emerging that the administration needs to address. And if it does, it can build support for the agreement. But it has to address them. The measure the administration has identified is not changing the structure of the Iranian nuclear program so that their peaceful intent is realized. That's not, or demonstrated. The measure is 1 year breakout time, meaning a year to produce a bomb's worth of fissile material, weapons-grade material. Now, when you make 1 year breakout time your measure, you put an absolute premium on verification, because whatever the combination of numbers of centrifuges, output from the centrifuges, quality of the centrifuges, stockpile of enriched material in the country, whatever the mix is, you can come up with a calculation that says, with that mix, it takes you 1 year to get from where you are to being able to produce one bomb's worth of material. But that assumes you detect what they're doing when they do it. And it also assumes something else, that when you detect it, you do something about it. The history of arms control agreements is when you have violations, you have long discussions about how to interpret what the violation means. If you're talking about 1 year, that 1 year gets eaten up really fast. So the administration needs to, first of all, address very clearly what happens, why they can make the case there is really 1 year. Because Bibi, when he gave his speech to the Congress, says the administration says 1 year, we think it's less than that. So they're going to have to explain why it is 1 year. Secondly, they're going to have to explain that they have a verification regime that means that no facilities are off limits. If the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, has a facility that is suspect, they can't block access to it. It's not just that you have 24/7 access to the known enrichment sites. You have to have access to what may be the undeclared sites, and you have to have access when you need it. So the administration has to make it clear why the verification regime answers the need. Then the administration also has to say, if we catch them, here's what happens. You can't decide what you're going to do about the violation after you get the violation, because you'll end up with a long discussion. Well, what do we do? It'll end up being a negotiation. Here again, you're going to lose your 1 year. And if you want to deter the Iranians in the first place, they should know in advance what different kinds of violations will produce what kinds of responses. This shouldn't be ambiguous, it shouldn't be unknown. And here again, I think the administration does that. It can answer what is a built-in vulnerability in the agreement that's emerging. Lastly, the deal will have a lifetime of not longer than 15 years. There may be aspects of it that will, like some of the verification aspects may continue beyond the 15 years, but after 15 years, the Iranians get treated like any other member of the NPT. They can build as large a nuclear infrastructure as they want. The Supreme Leader is talking about building an infrastructure that's 10 times the size of what they have now. And that will put them in a position where, you can, if you wanted to move really quickly, you could move really quickly. So what you need after the 15 years is dare I use this term, a red line. A red line that says if we see you moving towards a nuclear weapon, we will act militarily. The point about the issue of being prepared to exercise the military option is it has to be believed. It has to be tied to something that's believable. So the nature of violations and the responses have to be clear at the time of the deal, not later on. What happens after the deal as it relates to if we catch them or see them moving towards a nuclear weapon, they have to know that produces. We'll take out those nuclear facilities. That's what it means. So the idea that the only answer is we'll go bomb their sites now at a time when the world thinks we're close to an agreement, that means we bomb them, nobody supports us, and the world is then sympathetic as they rebuild. And by the way, the world is sympathetic as they rebuild without any oversight. So that's not an answer. It buys you a few years. You know, by that, I'd rather have an agreement that buys me 15 years than that answer. But I don't want an agreement that buys me 15 years that on 15 years plus one, the Iranians, when they want to go nuclear, they know they can do it. The verification, a lot of the verification means have to apply after 15 years, and they have to know what the consequence is going to be after 15 years, not just for the life of the agreement.
What if the Iranians reject the terms that you've just delineated?
Well, if they reject the terms I just delineated on verification, then it's not a deal that meets the standard the administration has set for itself. You won't have a one-year breakout time. You won't know it. If we can't have that kind of access, the measure that's been established is one-year breakout time. We don't have that. If you don't have that kind of transparency, you don't have it. So the administration has created verification as the essential element of this deal. So the verification can't have all sorts of holes in it. Otherwise, then they'll be free to get a bomb when they want it. And we won't even know. Or at least we might not know. In any case, we wouldn't have the time. The argument that a year gives us the time to detect and then to respond, that's only true if you actually have a year.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So the things that you were laying out as steps toward getting toward a two-state solution all sounded so reasonable, but...
That's because I'm so reasonable.
Yeah, right, aren't we all? But over there...
No, not everybody. Yeah.
No, I mean, over there, it doesn't seem to happen that way. I mean, it seems like some of these things have been tried. For example, in 2009, when Netanyahu made this moratorium on settlement construction and Abbas didn't respond at all. So what makes you think that that might change? And I can't imagine Netanyahu with his new coalition being willing to try that again anyway, but even if he did, why would it be different?
What is your evaluation of Hillary Clinton's ability to do statecrafting? And why not let Palestinians just declare a state unilaterally?
Okay, so on the first part, I would say what's different today, in a sense, of the circumstances for the Israelis. If they do nothing, you can see where things are going. They're going to either they'll actually face both. They'll face greater delegitimization internationally, and they'll certainly see some kind of Security Council resolution, which will be, from their standpoint, very problematic. So if you do nothing, that's what you're going to get. So that creates a very different set of incentives. And I don't agree with you that the government that could emerge wouldn't allow him to do it. Right now, he is stronger vis-a-vis the right. The right is weaker. Bennett is much weaker than he was. And, you know, he changed the shape of Likud, the lineup of Likud, so he's much stronger vis-a-vis Likud. They wouldn't be in without him. And he's in a much stronger position to do something should he want to do something. And what I'm saying to you is he's going to look at the circumstances and see there's a greater need to do something. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. And that's why I say our approach to it, you know, none of these things that I suggest are going to happen by themselves. The one thing I know for sure in the Middle East, nothing good ever happens by itself. So the question is, what do we have to do to help make it more likely that it could happen? I'm saying a quiet set of discussions with each side that says, you know, as the Prime Minister, look, we'll help you, but you got to give us something. We can't help you without anything. This is what it takes, and if you do that, here's what we can do for you. And I think that circumstance is different. What you cited in terms of the moratorium was for 10 months, no new starts, but you're allowed to complete the 3,000 that you have underway. So when it really became meaningful from a Palestinian standpoint, I mean, the Palestinians wanted it both ways. First they said it's insignificant, then when it was about to lapse, they said it's indispensable. It couldn't have been both, but you know, I understood what was going on. They realized, okay, now, since the Israelis finished the buildings that were underway, now it actually becomes meaningful. But it wasn't, you know, it didn't draw a distinction between the blocks and the non-blocks. So the first part of your question was on Hillary's statecraft, and the second part had to do with what's wrong with the Palestinians just declaring a state. All right, look, on her statecraft, I think that she's very skilled. I think she understands that the essence of good statecraft is defining objectives that you can actually fulfill. I mean, one of the problems that we have constantly run into is that we end up with a set of objectives, and the gulf between what we say and what we can do is huge. And the more often you state objectives you can't achieve, the less anybody believes you, which then makes it harder to convince anybody else to join you. So it has a kind of cascading effect. I think that she is kind of acutely aware of the marriage between objectives and means and how you frame objectives in public so that you can actually achieve what you lay out. As for the second question on declaring a state, you know, well, first, you know, they've gone and they've sought recognition of it already from multiple places. They've gotten, you know, a number of Europeans, a number of Latin Americans to do it. How has that advanced their cause? I mean, it's not, you know, the question is, the Palestinian national movement has been characterized by a preoccupation with symbols, not substance. When Salam Fayyad was the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, he adopted the approach that, why don't we build our state from the ground up? Let's create the circumstances of institutions that are so clear, so obvious, that the rest of the world looks at us and says, well, they created a state. Unfortunately, he was forced out, and the preoccupation is back on symbols, not on substance. What I would like to see for the Palestinian national movement is institution building, serious institution building. How about a rule of law? That would make a difference. By the way, it would have an impact on the political support. A lot of the problems that relate to the loss of support among the Palestinian public is the perception of corruption and the lack of any real law. And this would make a big difference. So I would rather see them focus on building institutions than looking for more statements or more symbols. It's been too many symbols and too little substance.
Go ahead.
I was curious, prominent neocons claim that ISIS should be left to do its own business, which will primarily be harassing Iran. How would you respond to that claim?
ISIS should be left, is that what you're saying?
Should be left alone to harass Iran.
Well, you know, I don't buy the idea that, you know, gee, their only focus is going to be Iran. I think they'll go after everybody. And sooner or later, they'll come after us. If they have a state from where they can completely operate, we'll all end up paying the price. They'll threaten everybody around them. It won't just be Iran. Threaten everybody around them. And sooner or later, they'll use it as a platform to attack us. So I think the idea that you sit back and don't do anything about them, that's a mistake. But I do think we have to understand we can't discredit them. They have to be discredited in the region. They have to be shown, you know, at the end of the day, if they're not discredited by Muslims, they're not going to be discredited. So, you know, there has to be a serious effort in the region to discredit them. It's not just fighting them militarily, it's also discrediting them so that their model becomes something that is unattractive for reasons that it's not seen as legitimate.
So we
I
have...
answered that one as opposed to two, didn't I?
That's right, you did. That's okay. You're Ambassador Ross. So we can take two more questions,
Okay.
and then it's time to wrap up. So I apologize to everyone else.
So very briefly, the plan that you've outlined, moving forward, starting with Israel, small steps, curb settlements beyond the barrier, increase Palestinian involvement and role and authority in Areas C. You mentioned very briefly that you think that Bibi's statement during the election was a political statement, but isn't it telling that in order to win, he had to make that statement? That elements within Likud and within the Jewish Home Party threatened his vote unless he would unequivocally come out against a two-state solution. This was a campaign where Naftali Bennett's slogan was not 1 centimeter. We're not apologizing. And moreover, over the course of the campaign, the Prime Minister and many figures on the right were often running against President Obama and vilifying him. Given that, how does the president induce the government coalition that's going to come out, which will include Likud and elements very hostile to the president, and will include Jewish Home, which includes elements extremely hostile to the president and to the very specific steps that you outlined. Now, personally, I think those are great steps, but I think that the core the core political base of the center of power in the coalition was elected precisely on a platform opposed to the kinds of things you outlined. So how can the president effectively induce what you have proposed? Thank you.
So before you were mentioning these steps that Ari was also mentioning just now, I'm Hannah, by the way. So from what I understand in terms of negotiations, and negotiating a two-state solution, there's a limit to how much the Israelis, how much the Palestinians actually need to compromise in terms of the West Bank, and the Israelis compromising in terms of the West Bank, for example, let's say. If we look at Netanyahu's settlement expansion history, I guess you could say, and in terms of what we can expect from him in the future, what sort of red line would you put down in terms of how much that can actually be flouted and still have a possible two-state solution, considering that we see that these lines are constantly being crossed?
Okay. One of the images of Israeli settlement building is that it's gobbling up all the territory of the West Bank. Anybody know how much territory the actual settlements take up in the West Bank?
5%.
You say 5%? 4%? 2%. It's not the settlements that gobble up all the territory, it's all the separate roads, it's everything that's done to serve the settlements. So it's not the settlements per se that make that impossible, it's everything that goes to support the expansion. But that's why I say, if you suddenly stop building beyond the blocks, then you really have changed that. And that gives you the ability to produce a two-state outcome, which is, I suggested, not only because it can change the realities for Israel, but I think it also preserves the two-state outcome as something that can still be achieved. And that gets to the heart of your question, which is, what about the backbone, of the coalition? Well, Naftali Bennett has 8 seats. Is that the backbone of the coalition?
But in order to win and to take seats back from Bennett, Netanyahu had to come out and denounce the two-state.
It's true, and if he didn't have Kahlon, he would not have a government now.
Do you think so?
I'm just saying, if he doesn't have Kahlon, he doesn't have enough to form a government. Meaning, the actual split in the Israeli society is not so clear-cut. There were 2 center parties. Kahlon ran in the center. And the point is, the makeup of Likud is different than it was in the last government. The makeup of Likud, the list last time, was much more hardline than it is this time. I'm not saying they're soft, but I'm saying that you have a prime minister who is pretty powerful when it comes to this. I'm not saying it's simple. To do what I'm suggesting is not simple. But prime minister has a choice. He can look at the rest of the world and what's going to happen. The rest of the world is not going to remain static. Many will say, why are they focused on this when they should be looking at the rest of the region? Well, it doesn't matter. This isn't an argument. This is not an argument. We can go to Europe and say, why are you paying attention to this? There is a reality there, and it has a momentum of its own. And if you don't do something to deal with it, you're going to face increasing isolation. You're going to face increasing delegitimization. It is fine and good for the Prime Minister to talk about the threat that Iran poses to Israel. I understand that. I understand it completely. But you know what? You know what else is an existential threat to Israel? The delegitimization movement. And to do nothing is to let that movement take on a life of its own and pay the price for it. So when he looks at what his choices are, it seems to me that, you know, if he stops building beyond the blocks, it's not simple, but what's the alternative? And if he presents it, you know, if there's anybody who's proven himself to be the master of Israeli politics, it's Benjamin Netanyahu. So if this is something that he feels he needs to do for the well-being of Israel, because it is an existential threat, no less, it's a different kind of existential threat than Iran, to be sure, then somehow I think he can find a way to do it. I'm not suggesting that the President of the United States is going to be the one who is going to go do this. He's not going to do it. We need to have a quiet channel, though, to the Israelis and focus on how we can broker what could be possible. You know, my answer would be, there is a possibility here, there's a need here. And leadership comes from, you make choices based on what the need is. So, you know, he's the Prime Minister of Israel again. He has a chance to be, if he serves out 4 years, he will be the longest serving Prime Minister ever. And I don't think he wants his legacy to be that he presided over the complete isolation of Israel. He doesn't want his legacy to be that Iran created a nuclear weapon either. So those are two big issues for him. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you to the students and the organizations involved in organizing, and thank you, Ambassador Ross, for your time. Thank you.